In the annals of 20th century political thought, few works have proven as enduringly prophetic and forensically precise as Kwame Nkrumah's 1965 masterpiece, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Published just 1 year before the coup that would depose him, the book stands as the political last will and testament of Africa's foremost champion of unity. It is an unflinching indictment of a global system designed to perpetuate colonial modes of exploitation under the guise of national sovereignty. Nkrumah, the intellectual son of Marcus Garvey and the first Prime Minister and President of an independent Ghana, did not merely coin a term. He dissected a living, breathing organism of economic domination, laying bare its arteries of finance, its sinews of corporate power, and its political nervous system. To understand neo-colonialism through Nkrumah's eyes is to understand the fundamental paradox of modern Africa, a continent of immense wealth, whose people remain systematically impoverished. This analysis, rooted in his magnum opus and enriched by a Pan-African vision for a liberated continent, remains the essential starting point for any serious discussion of Africa's past, present, and future. Before one can grasp the depths of the neo-colonial trap Nkrumah described, one must first appreciate the profound Pan-African vision of liberation he was fighting for. His was not simply a struggle for political independence, it was a revolutionary project aimed at the complete restoration of African dignity and the reassertion of the African personality on the world stage. His mission, as scholar Vincent Dodo notes, was to dismantle colonialism in Africa and to create a world where the African could function as an equal player and partner. This vision was philosophically grounded in what Nkrumah termed consciencism, a framework first articulated in his 1964 book, Consciencism, Philosophy and Ideology for Decolonization. Consciencism was Nkrumah's answer to the cultural and psychological schizophrenia inflicted by colonialism. He argued that the modern African conscience was torn between three competing influences: the traditional, pre-colonial African heritage, the legacy of Islamic culture, particularly in the North, and the pervasive impact of the Euro-Christian West. Consciencism sought to synthesize these elements into a new ideology, one that was materialist in its analysis of social forces, but rooted in the communalistic, egalitarian, and humanist values of traditional African society. It was a call to embrace modern science and technology, but to deploy them in the service of a socialist, human-centered society, rather than a capitalist one. This philosophy was inherently Pan-African, insisting that Africa's intellectual and political path must be charted from its own historical and cultural center, not from the periphery of European thought. This vision of a renewed Africa was inseparable from the goal of continental unity. In his 1963 work, Africa Must Unite, Nkrumah argued with relentless logic that the Balkanized states inherited from colonialism were economically unviable and politically powerless. He saw the fragmentation of the continent as the primary tool of neo-colonialism, a deliberate strategy to keep African nations small, weak, and competing against each other for the sale of their raw materials to the industrialized world. A united Africa, by contrast, could pool its immense resources, create a vast internal market, and negotiate with the world's great powers from a position of strength. This was not a vague dream, but a concrete political and economic project, which culminated in the founding of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, on May 25, 1963, in Addis Ababa, a compromise in his view, but a necessary first step. The entire edifice of neo-colonialism, as diagnosed by Nkrumah, rests upon a foundational, brutal paradox. As he opens chapter 1 of Neo-Colonialism, Africa is a paradox which illustrates and highlights neo-colonialism. Her earth is rich, yet the products that come from above and below her soil continue to enrich, not Africans predominantly, but groups and individuals who operate to Africa's impoverishment. Nkrumah proceeds to substantiate this claim with a devastating statistical inventory of the continent's wealth. He notes that while Africa contained about 8% of the world's population at the time, it accounted for a mere 2% of its total production. Yet, its untapped potential was staggering. Iron reserves twice the size of America's, coal reserves sufficient to last for 300 years, and over 40% of the world's potential water power, of which less than 5% was being utilized. The continent, he showed, was a treasure trove of the world's most critical industrial minerals and metals. He provided a detailed table showing the startling degree to which British industry in 1957 depended on African resources. This dependency was not unique to Britain. French industry was similarly reliant, sourcing 100% of its phosphates, 85% of its lead, and 51% of its zinc ore from Africa. The core of the neo-colonial crime, Nkrumah argued, was that not a single integrated industry was built in Africa based on any of these resources. The ore was extracted, shipped out in its raw or semi-finished state to feed the factories of Europe, America, and Japan, and then sold back to Africa as finished goods at grossly inflated prices. He cites the example of the Swaziland Iron Ore Development Company, a joint venture of the Anglo-American Corporation and the British steel giant Guest Keen and Nettlefolds, which, starting in 1964, was contracted to ship 1.2 million tons of iron ore annually for 10 years to a Japanese steel combine. The processing, the value addition, the skilled jobs, all were located outside of Africa. How was this state of affairs maintained after the flags of colonial powers were lowered? Nkrumah's great contribution was to move beyond rhetoric and provide a detailed anatomy of the instruments of neo-colonial control. The essence of neo-colonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system, and thus its political policy, is directed from outside. This external direction, he explained, was multifaceted. 1. Economic and monetary domination. This was the primary lever. The neo-colonial state's economy is externally oriented, producing what it does not consume and consuming what it does not produce. Control is exercised through the banking system, which remains an extension of Western financial houses, and through the manipulation of foreign exchange. The state is often compelled to import manufactured goods from the former colonial power and is prevented from developing its own industrial base. 2. Balkanization. As mentioned, the division of Africa into a patchwork of small, economically non-viable states was, for Nkrumah, the major instrument of neo-colonialism. It fostered dependency and prevented the formation of a powerful, unified economic bloc. 3. The role of international financial institutions. Nkrumah was deeply suspicious of institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. He saw them not as neutral arbiters of development, but as instruments of Western policy, imposing conditions, also known as conditionalities, that serve the interests of foreign capital. He understood that their loans and aid packages often came with strings attached that pried open economies, enforced austerity, and prevented states from pursuing independent, socialist-oriented development paths. Ghana, under Nkrumah, pointedly refused to engage with the IMF, a decision that was reversed only after his overthrow. 4. The aid and debt trap. Foreign aid, in Nkrumah's analysis, was rarely altruistic. It was a means of exerting political pressure, financing the export of goods from the donor country and creating a cycle of dependency. The accumulation of debt became a powerful tool, forcing African nations into a state of perpetual servitude, where a significant portion of their earnings was diverted to servicing loans from the very powers exploiting their resources. 5. The corporate web. The most detailed and damning sections of neo-colonialism are dedicated to mapping the intricate network of multinational corporations that dominated Africa's economy. He demonstrated with painstaking detail how a handful of powerful firms with interlocking directorates and complex holding structures controlled vast swathes of the continent's resources. Behind the facade of separateness, he wrote, strong connecting links bind these powerful firms together. Nowhere were these mechanisms more brutally and tragically demonstrated than in the Congo. The crisis that began with independence on June 30th, 1960, and culminated in the assassination of its first democratically elected Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, on January 17th, 1961, was for Nkrumah the quintessential neo-colonial crime. The central villain in this drama was Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, the Belgian mining conglomerate that controlled the immense mineral wealth of the Katanga province. When Lumumba sought to assert genuine economic sovereignty, the company, with the backing of Belgian and other Western intelligence agencies, engineered the secession of Katanga under the puppet leadership of Moise Tshombe. In a powerful speech to the Ghanaian National Assembly on March 22, 1965, Nkrumah provided a forensic accounting of the plunder. In the 5 years preceding independence, the net capital outflow from the Congo to Belgium alone was £464 million. When Lumumba took power, a wave of capital flight orchestrated by foreign interests created a national deficit of £40 million. An arbitrary external debt of $900 million was imposed on the Congolese people, owed to the very US and Belgian monopolies that had extracted billions from their land. In a single year, Union Minière's profits reached £27 million, yet between 1950 and 1957, while the Congo's national production rose by 60%, the buying power of the average African decreased by 13%. Nkrumah's analysis went deeper, exposing the corporate web that made this possible. He showed how Union Minière was itself linked to Tanganyika Concessions, a British company registered in 1899. Tanganyika Concessions, in turn, held a 90% stake in the strategic Benguela Railway, which transported minerals from the Congo and Zambia through Angola to the sea. It was also interlinked with the British South Africa Company, the Rhodesia Katanga Company Limited, and through them to American giants like the Newmont Mining Corporation and the powerful Anglo-American Corporation of South Africa. This was not a collection of independent companies. It was a global cartel, a financial and industrial leviathan that stretched from the mines of Katanga to the boardrooms of London, Brussels, and New York, all working in concert to ensure that Africa's wealth flowed in one direction, outwards. Kwame Nkrumah's reward for so clearly and courageously exposing this system was his overthrow. On February 24, 1966, while he was on a peace mission to Vietnam, the Ghanaian military, with documented support from the CIA, seized power in a coup codenamed Operation Cold Chop. His analysis had hit too close to the bone. The powers he had named and shamed would not tolerate a leader who sought to break the chains of neo-colonialism and forge a truly independent, unified, and prosperous Africa. Decades after his death, Nkrumah's analysis in Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, remains not just relevant, but urgent. The mechanisms of control have evolved. The language is now of structural adjustment, good governance, and public-private partnerships. But the fundamental dynamics of resource extraction, debt peonage, and external control persist. The book is more than a historical document. It is a field manual for understanding the enduring challenges facing the African continent. It is a testament to a leader who saw the future with painful clarity and who sacrificed everything in the struggle for a vision of Africa that remains to this day an unfinished revolution. The Ghosts of Independence: How the Assassination of Pan-African Dreams Devalues Africa Today. To understand the persistent, corrosive narratives that devalue Africa today, the pervasive imagery of helplessness, the single story of poverty and corruption, one cannot simply point to present-day challenges. One must look back to the ghosts of the post-independence era, to the specific, targeted, and systematic elimination of a generation of visionary leaders who dared to imagine a different future for the continent. The fates of Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and others were not isolated tragedies or the inevitable outcomes of internal strife. They were, in large part, the result of a concerted neo-colonial campaign to decapitate the Pan-African movement and ensure that political independence would never translate into genuine economic sovereignty. The subsequent decades of instability, kleptocracy, and dependency were not a failure of the African character, but a direct and calculated consequence of these foundational assassinations, the effects of which continue to fuel the very Afro-pessimism used to justify external intervention and control. The story of this systematic dismantling begins in the heart of the continent, in the resource-rich Congo. When the Republic of Congo gained independence from Belgium on June 30th, 1960, its first democratically elected Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, embodied the hopes of a nation and a continent. His vision was simple yet revolutionary: a unified Congo, free from tribal division, whose immense mineral wealth would be used to develop the nation for its own people. His shortfall, in the eyes of the West, was his uncompromising nationalism. In the midst of the Cold War, his refusal to be a puppet and his assertion of economic sovereignty were unforgivable. In his famous Independence Day speech, he broke with diplomatic niceties and spoke directly of the brutalities of Belgian rule, sealing his fate in the eyes of his former colonial masters and their allies. We have known harassing work exacted in exchange for salaries which did not permit us to eat enough to drive away hunger, or to clothe ourselves, or to house ourselves decently, or to raise our children as creatures dear to our hearts. The response was swift and brutal. The Belgian-backed secession of the mineral-rich Katanga province, led by Moise Tshombe and protected by the mining giant Union Minière, was engineered to cripple the new state. Declassified documents and historical records, including the Church Committee reports, have since confirmed the active role of the United States and Belgium in destabilizing Lumumba's government. The CIA launched a covert program to eliminate him, which included aborted plots to poison him. On January 17, 1961, less than 7 months after taking office, Lumumba was captured, tortured, and executed by Katangan secessionists with Belgian complicity. His murder was the original sin of Africa's post-colonial era. The immediate consequence was the installation of the kleptocratic dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, who for 32 years would faithfully serve Western interests, rename the country Zaire, and plunder its wealth, leaving it one of the most impoverished and unstable nations on earth. If Lumumba was the heart of African nationalism, Kwame Nkrumah was its intellectual and political engine. As the leader of the first sub-Saharan African nation to achieve independence in 1957, and the author of the seminal 1965 text, Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, Nkrumah was the world's foremost advocate for a United States of Africa. He argued with relentless logic that only a politically and economically unified continent could resist the divide and rule tactics of neo-colonialism. He invested heavily in infrastructure, such as the Akosombo Dam, and promoted a philosophy of consciencism to forge a new African personality. Nkrumah's shortfall was twofold. Domestically, his ambition led to growing debt, and his response to political opposition became increasingly authoritarian, culminating in the declaration of a one-party state. Internationally, his vocal and detailed condemnation of Western economic exploitation, particularly in neo-colonialism, made him a primary target. The book was a declaration of war, meticulously naming the corporations and outlining the financial mechanisms of control. The response was predictable. On February 24, 1966, while Nkrumah was on a peace mission to Vietnam, he was overthrown in a military coup codenamed Operation Cold Chop. Declassified U.S. documents later confirmed the CIA's deep involvement and support for the coup plotters. The consequences for Ghana were immediate and catastrophic. The new military junta, grappling with an economic mess it was ill-equipped to handle, abandoned Nkrumah's industrialization projects and Pan-African ambitions. The country entered a prolonged period of political instability, marked by a succession of coups that derailed its development trajectory for decades. With Nkrumah's fall, the Pan-African movement lost its most powerful and articulate champion, and the dream of continental unity suffered a blow from which it has never fully recovered. 2 decades later, the same pattern repeated itself in the small, landlocked nation of Burkina Faso. In 1983, a charismatic young army captain named Thomas Sankara came to power and launched one of the most ambitious and inspiring revolutionary projects in African history. A fervent admirer of Lumumba and Nkrumah, Sankara was a new generation Pan-Africanist who translated ideology into immediate, tangible action. He renamed the country from the colonial Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning land of upright people. In just 4 years, his achievements were staggering, accomplished almost entirely without foreign aid. Sankara's achievements, 1983 to 1987, vaccinated 2.5 million children against measles, meningitis, and yellow fever in a matter of weeks, oversaw the construction of over 350 schools, along with new roads and railways, launched a nationwide literacy campaign, dramatically increasing literacy rates, implemented land reform and agricultural programs that led to food self-sufficiency, outlawed female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and polygamy, and appointed women to high government positions. Sankara's shortfall was his radical self-reliance and his vocal anti-imperialist stance on the world stage, where he condemned the mechanisms of debt as a new form of colonialism. On October 15, 1987, Sankara, aged just 37, was assassinated along with 12 of his colleagues in a coup orchestrated by his close friend and second-in-command, Blaise Compaoré, with documented backing from France and other regional powers. The aftermath was a textbook case of neo-colonial restoration. Compaoré immediately reversed Sankara's nationalist and socialist policies, welcomed the IMF and World Bank, and ruled for 27 years as a key ally of France in the region. The revolutionary spirit was extinguished, and Burkina Faso was returned to the fold of dependency. The stories of Lumumba, Nkrumah, and Sankara are not exceptions. They are part of a clear and devastating pattern. From the assassination of Guinea-Bissau's liberation theorist Amilcar Cabral in 1973 to the 2011 NATO-led overthrow and killing of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who was attempting to create a gold-backed African currency, the message has been consistent. African leaders who pursue genuine sovereignty and continental unity will be eliminated. The long-term effect of this campaign of decapitation is the Africa we see today, a continent whose political and economic landscape is profoundly scarred by these historical traumas. The installation of compliant, corrupt leaders, post-coup created systems of governance geared not towards national development, but towards personal enrichment and the facilitation of foreign extraction. This fostered the very corruption and instability that Western media now presents as an inherent African trait. This leads directly to the persistent devaluation of the continent, the narrative of a hopeless or helpless Africa, as described by scholars and writers like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in her concept of the single story, is not an accident. It is the necessary ideological smoke screen for neo-colonialism. An Africa defined by its potential, its resources, and its revolutionary history is a threat. An Africa defined by poverty, disease, and war is one that requires saving. Through aid, loans, and military intervention, the very tools of neo-colonial control. This narrative has tangible costs, with recent reports showing that negative media stereotypes cost the continent billions annually in inflated interest payments on sovereign debt. The ghosts of Lumumba, Nkrumah, and Sankara haunt the continent not as reminders of failure, but as evidence of a stolen future. A future that can only be reclaimed by understanding precisely how and by whom it was taken. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter